Why in the world does God wait until the very last minute to answer our prayers? We're going to try to answer that today as we continue our series in Genesis, where God and two angels showed up literally in person with a message for Abraham and Sarah. And the message was that she was going to have a baby. And they were like, what? We've been waiting 20 years. And now at 90 years old, God tells Sarah that she's going to actually have a baby? Why would God wait until that long? Join us today for the answer. All right, welcome back. We are super excited to be back with our Genesis series. It's been a while since we've been here. We took our summer break, so that's why no one has seen us with this particular series. So it's good to be back. And a lot has actually happened over our summer break. I'll put a couple pictures up here for those of you that actually know us, know our family and all that. But here you go. Here is Dusty, our baby. And he got engaged this summer. So he and Jackie will be getting married in the next few months. So that's super exciting for us. And then for those of you that know Cheyenne, sweet little Cheyenne married Brad last year. And she just didn't think it would be easy for her to get pregnant. So the doctor said, go off of the pill. And she did. And within like a day, she was pregnant. So she just had sweet little Susie. So Susie came about 3 weeks early, and we ended up having to come home from our vacation, but it was super well worth it. How's that? Because we got to see her, and she's super adorable. So anyway, that's what went on this summer, some news. So what happens now is, for our Genesis series, is we moved our Wednesday Bible study. We used to do it once a month. We're moving it back to a once a week. So what's going to happen is I'm going to be videotaping all our Genesis, our Monday Psalm series, our Friday question and answer series, someplace completely different than Rio Vista. So I won't be doing in front of live crowds any longer. And so the worst part about that is I will have to be the only one laughing at my ridiculous jokes. So that's pretty much where that goes. But if you're ever in Phoenix, come hang out with us on Wednesday mornings, because we will be doing our Bible study at Rio Vista, but it just won't be in front of cameras there any longer. So the good part to that is I can say anything I want now. All right, today we are back in Genesis, and we're going to hit 2 points today. One is that God shows up when he needs to. And what we're going to see in Genesis today is God needed to show up to Abraham, and he does it literally, like he literally shows up in a human body. And then we're going to go at the very end, and we're going to talk about why does God wait until the last minute, the very last minute, to answer our prayers. So we left off with Abraham and Sarah. At the time that we left off with them, Abraham was 99 years old, and Sarah was about 90, okay? They'd been married a whole bunch of years, which of course I have to start off with a really corny joke, which you know that about me. I wonder if Sarah dealt with what this bride actually dealt with. A bride was very upset after her honeymoon, so her mother asked her why. And she said, Mom, the honeymoon was wonderful, but on the way back, my husband started using some really horrible language I'd never heard of before, like really bad 4-letter words. And the mom was shocked, and she said, honey, what 4-letter words did he use? And sobbing, the bride said, Mom, he used words like wash, iron, cook. I was like, okay, there you go. But I don't know if Sarah had to deal with that. She probably did. But let's catch up with the story of Abraham, since it's been so long since we've actually been back here. When Abraham first came on the scene in Genesis, he was 75 years old, and God called him from a place called Ur. Ur is what we know as modern-day Iraq. We'll put a map up here so you can see. At the very bottom down there to the right, it'll say Babylonia. Right below that is Ur. So this is where God called Abraham. Abraham goes up north to Haran, and then he goes into the land of Canaan, which we know the land of Israel right now. They get in there, but the first thing that happens is there's a famine. And he's like, what in the world am I going to do? So they go down to Egypt because Egypt had food down there. Now, in Egypt, I guess Sarah was supposedly spectacularly beautiful. So he was afraid that maybe he would die and, the Pharaoh would kill him so that Sarah could be in his harem. So he has Sarah lie for him and say, look, this is my, I'm the sister. Abraham says, this is my sister. And not so much his wife, and that got him in a lot of trouble. But chaos breaks out, disaster breaks out, hits Egypt. The king figures out, realizes that Abraham's lying. And he sends Sarah and Abraham out of the country. And he's saying, goodbye, leave. Here's a bunch of cattle. Here's a bunch of stuff. And here's some, servants you can take with you. Well, one of the maids that ended up coming from Egypt, we know her name was Hagar. Now, it's interesting because God had called Abraham to be the father of many nations. He made a covenant with Abraham that he would be this father. But the problem was his wife, Sarah, was completely barren. She was unable to have children, and she's kind of getting up there in age. So for 10 years, Abraham and Sarah are so confused. They're like, I don't understand what's going to happen, because if Abraham's supposed to be the father of many nations, I can't get pregnant. This is what Sarah's thinking was. So they start questioning God. And Sarah had a really good point. She's like, Abraham, every time God spoke to you, he never mentioned my name. He just mentioned you. So maybe children aren't even supposed to come through me. So Sarah comes up with this super crazy, ridiculous idea, and that is to give her Egyptian maid to Abraham, and then he could have a child with her, and then that would, then Abraham and Sarah would raise this child and all that. But anyway, really, really bad idea. Abraham goes along with it. Hagar gets pregnant. Abraham is 85 years old, and suddenly Sarah has issues with her maid. Now suddenly Hagar is flaunting that she's pregnant, and Sarah begins to mistreat her. So Hagar leaves and runs away. She's going back to Egypt. So the plan is that Hagar now understands that she's going to have a baby. His name is going to be Ishmael. But God had a plan for her unborn child. We saw this in our last lesson in Genesis 17, verse 20. God says, and as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply and exceedingly. And he shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. God tells Abraham this when it comes to, in regards to his son Ishmael. We know that Ishmael is going to be the father of the Arab nation. So what I want to do is pick up the story right there after the next verse. Chapter 17, verse 21, God is telling Abraham this, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So Sarah doesn't know any of this. God tells this to Abram. He says, Isaac's going to be born in the next year. Ishmael's going to, he's going to be the father of a whole different people group. And so Isaac would be the father of the Jewish nation. He would be the promised child. So he goes home and apparently tells Sarah this, but I think Sarah is probably laughing. She's probably like, are you joking? Like, do you not know how old I am right now? Because if this happened, she's 90. Who has a baby at 90 years old? I always have to tell my funny little joke about the elderly lady that miraculously got pregnant, had a little baby. Her neighbor came to see the baby, but the elderly woman kept offering her tea and food and wouldn't show her the baby. The neighbor finally got really nervous and worried and demanded to see the baby. And the elderly lady said, well, I'm waiting for him to cry because I can't remember where I put him. I'm like, that's exactly how it would be with me. So having a baby at 90, that sounds horrifying, actually. But why did God wait until the last minute? Like, why did God do that? We'll talk about that at the end, but let's pick up our story here and what's going on. Now, around the time that God spoke to Abraham and told him, that this is what's going to happen with Ishmael, and I have a plan for Isaac, something happened, and it was kind of amazing. And here you go. God showed up literally, okay? Well, we hear this all the time. People will say, God showed up to me today. Maybe it was at a church service. Maybe you just felt all this emotion. You felt like God showed up. But that's not what happened for Abraham. Abraham wasn't in a church service. He wasn't on his knees praying. God just showed up literally in person in the course of Abraham's normal everyday life. Because a lot of times that's when it happens. God shows up to show us something in normal everyday life. And it's not even so much like he actually literally physically shows up, but it could come in lots of different forms. It could be just like you're walking along and all of a sudden you have this thought and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to go do that. Maybe some people have, visions. Maybe it's you're reading the Word of God, the Bible, and suddenly a verse just jumps out at you and you know that you're supposed to do that. That's how God speaks to you. And maybe it's a missionary showing up at church and the Holy Spirit is showing you a specific place of need that maybe you need to put your money or maybe you need to go. We see it all through the Bible. Think about this. We think about David. David's a teenager. He's just minding his own business. He's watching the sheep. His dad's like, hey, go take your brother some food. It never occurred to him that this would be a life-changing moment for him. Here you go. He would now be on God's new path for his life. See, when God speaks to us and shows us something, now we're going his direction and not so much our direction. Think about Noah. Noah, he's probably working, I don't know, maybe he was a carpenter. Maybe he's building a chair, minding his own business. And then God shows up and says, hey, I need you to take the next 100 years and build a boat. All right? Here's the deal. He would now be on God's new path for his life. Same thing with Moses. Moses is just out tending sheep, okay, minding his own business. God shows up in a burning bush with an encounter that will change the course of Moses' life forever. Because now, he would now be on God's new path for his life. God shows up so often in our life when we're just doing normal things. Think about Rick Warren's wife started a ministry. She started a ministry because she was reading a magazine one day and saw the horrors of what HIV was doing in Africa. She starts a ministry that she felt God was calling her to because, her normal everyday life, she just picked up a magazine and started reading. And God was like, no, I need you to do that. We look at like Franklin Graham. How did Samaritan's Purse with the shoe boxes? Where did that even start? Well, he just got a phone call one day out of the blue, 1993. A man in England asking if he'd be willing to just fill some shoe boxes for children in war-torn Bosnia. That was the start of it, a huge project. So this is just a reminder that as a follower of Jesus, God has a job for you. So be on the lookout. Don't think that you're just going to hear from God when you're in church or you're just feeling emotional one day. Or sometimes God just out of the blue shows up and shows you what he wants you to do. So back in the days of Abraham, remember, they didn't have the entirety of the Bible. So often God would have to step out of heaven, show up and talk with someone on the earth. And that is going to happen here. So let me set the stage. In Israel, if you've never been there before, in the summertime, it is hot. And I mean seriously hot. Like we live in Arizona, and it's hot here in the summertime, but it's really hot in Israel. And then there's that humidity that comes along with it. So whenever we've gone to Israel to videotape, we videotape for our Luke series and for our Parables series, we always went in the summertime only because that was when we were off Bible study and that was the only time we could really go. But most people don't go in the summertime because, like I said, the heat is pretty unbearable. And if you go down by the Dead Sea, like what's right behind me here, this is the Dead Sea back here. These are the mountains. This is Israel. So this is what it looks like. But imagine that. This is where Abraham, was hanging out. But I want you to imagine living in a tent. No air conditioning, no restaurants, no malls to just run there and get out of the heat. No swimming pools, okay? The Dead Sea, not even worth swimming in, okay? It's salt water, and you float to the top. It's not even a place to go swimming. I thought this was cute about heat. There was a story of an Illinois man. He left the snow-filled streets of Chicago for a vacation down in Florida. His wife was on a business trip, so he was planning to meet her the next day. So when he reached his hotel room, he decided to send his wife a quick email. Unfortunately, when he typed in her email address, he missed one letter, and the email didn't go to his wife, who was coming to visit him in Florida. It ended up going to an elderly woman, a pastor's wife, whose husband had just passed away the day earlier. When the grieving widow checked her email, she took one look and fainted, because here's what she read. Dearest wife, remember, this was supposed to go to the lady going to Florida with her husband the next day. Just got checked in. Everything's prepared for your arrival tomorrow. P.S. It sure is hot down here. So this poor pastor's wife thought that came from her husband. Wasn't in heaven. Kind of sad. Anyway, because of this heat, the IVP background commentary says this about where Abraham lived. The goatskin tents of nomadic people were designed to hold in heat at night with the flaps down and to allow a breeze to pass through during the day when the flaps were up. So because of the heat, what would happen is people would wake up really early in the morning, they'd get their chores done, their animals fed, and everything would be taken care of, and then they would go back to their tents for like their siesta. People would be enjoying their tents, with a little bit of shade, but on this particular day, everything would be different. Abraham wasn't expecting this. We read this in Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. And that's exactly what's about ready to happen. What we read next is what I said before. God showed up literally, along with two angels, which we'll talk more about angels next week. So 3 spiritual beings, one being God himself, will take on human flesh, become one of us, and come and speak with Abraham. We'll pick it up in Genesis 18:1. Then the Lord appeared to him. Now the word Lord in the Hebrew concordance means this: Jehovah, or the existing one, the proper name of the one true God, the proper name of the deity Yahweh. So we know that the Lord, this was God himself. So we talked a lot before about a Christophany, and this is where a pre-incarnate Jesus would actually come down, and this makes the most sense because we've never ever seen God the Father step out of heaven. But we have seen Christophanies all over the Bible where Jesus seems to. So however this played out, God has now stepped out of heaven and he's right there. So then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre. Now, I put a picture up here because we are thousands and thousands of years removed from these trees, but these are what the trees would have looked like. So there must have been a section where Abraham was in around Hebron that actually had all these beautiful trees, and that's probably why he ended up going there and putting his tent there and living there, because it gave a lot of shade. Genesis 18, verse 1, we'll go there. Then the Lord appeared to him by the Terabith trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Now, who knows, maybe Abraham just kind of nodded off a little bit. Maybe he just suddenly heard a noise. I don't know. Verse 2 says this: he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and he bowed himself to the ground. I laughed when I read that, because I thought, wow, if someone comes ringing my doorbell, I literally never run out to see who it is, okay? It's just like, oh, for the love, who is at the door? It would never occur to me to just open the door and invite someone to dinner. But back in the days of Abraham, hospitality was a huge thing. It still is in Israel. But we don't get that very much here in America. For so many neighbors, like they're just like, I don't know my neighbor. I just pull in my driveway and I shut the garage, and I don't know anyone who lives by me. But that's how it is here. It's not like that in Israel. When Rob and we walk around the neighborhood sometimes, and he'll be like, we should have a barbecue. We should get to know the people in our neighborhood. And I was like, nah, maybe like 15 years from now. Let's try it then. So I'm pretty much the worst at this hospitality thing. But for Abraham, he must have been shocked, because here in front of him stood like 3 men. He doesn't know where they came from. He doesn't know where they were going. But what he does is he runs and he bows down to them. He's 99 years old. I can't even imagine that. The thought of running, I'm 62. The thought of running and bowing, that just seems like a whole lot of work. I read this, I thought this was really cute. This lady writes up, I'm never lonely because I have 4 men in my life. I get up with Charlie horse because this is what happens when you get old. I spend the day with arthritis. I dine with willpower, and I go to bed with Ben Gay, okay? So that's what happens when you get older. It's Charlie horses and arthritis and you're trying to deal with willpower and Ben Gay because everything hurts. So the thought of going and running to someone and bowing down, it would take me a while to like get down there and then get back up again. But this was their culture, okay? Maybe when Abraham saw him, he was so excited to finally have somebody that he could talk to. Verse 3 said this, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servants. Now the word in the Hebrew concordance doesn't mean God, it means like master or owner. Sometimes women called their husbands Lord, which just so you know, I have never called Rob that. But I want to talk about the word bowed for a minute. The word bowed, very important word, you're going to find it 100 times in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word to bow down, to do homage, to give reverence to. It is the most frequently used word in the Old Testament for the translation in our English, worship. To bow down, to worship. In the Orient, in the Middle East, especially back then, it was very typical to greet somebody who was more esteemed than you are, like royalty. If you were in the presence of a king or a queen, you would get down on your knees and you would gently and slowly incline your head until your forehead would touch the ground. And that was a sign of respect. I acknowledge that you are greater, higher, and to be revered. Abraham is 99 years old. Abraham has 318 paid trained servants. He has flocks and lots of herds. He's made an impact already in his culture. He would be called in the Middle East today, if he were alive, a sheikh, somebody who has and exerts great influence on large numbers of people. So this would be Abraham. And so you would think like he's so important. Why in the world would he go bow down to some strangers knowing that about that word? He has a lot of money. Why would he do that? He has servants. He's very, very important. Now, the interesting part is we don't know at this point if he actually knows this is God. There's 2 sides to this. Some people actually think he knew right away that this was God. One pastor writes this because he thinks this. He said he believes that Abraham instinctively knew he was in the presence of God, mostly because he's had different appearances of God to Abraham. Genesis 12:1, when God first called him. We don't know how that all played out, but maybe God showed up to him then. When Abraham parted ways with Lot in Genesis 13. When he met Melchizedek, maybe that was a place when God came and spoke to him. When God made a covenant with him, and put Abraham to sleep, like God was right there. When God restated his covenant last week, or the last lesson in Genesis 17. So if in fact Abraham really did know this, it was God, it would make sense that he would go and bow down. Because when you're standing in front of God himself, you realize something. You realize, you know what? I'm not really that important in life. And when that happens, you bow. You bow down and worship. Skip Heitzig tells a really funny story. He talks about an old minister who survived the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania. And so he always told people all the time, how I survived, and I survived the Johnstown flood. Everyone he would meet, he would say, have you heard this? Have you heard that I survived this? And he would always have to tell, and people would roll their eyes like, yeah, we've heard that before. But one day this man died, went to heaven. Peter in heaven said, you know what? Tonight we're going to have a big gathering. We're going to tell our stories about what happened on earth and how you came to know Jesus. The old pastor got really excited. He ran up to Peter and he said, hey, Peter, have you heard how I made it through the Johnstown flood? I survived it. He began to tell him the story. He said, can I share this story tonight with everyone in heaven? Peter looked at him and he said, buddy, He said, you can, but I just want to remind you that Noah will be in the audience tonight. The bottom line is this: if you are going to tell about a flood and Noah is in there listening, it better be a way better story than the actual flood, all right? Because it changes the whole complexion of a good story if Noah's in the audience. There you go. Max Lucado said this: you don't boast about your paper airplane when you're dealing with NASA. You don't brag about your crayon sketches in the presence of Picasso. You don't claim equality with Albert Einstein because you can write H2O. And you never ever talk about your own goodness in the presence of the perfect one. That's sort of the idea here. Abraham probably, if he does recognize, he recognizes this is God and he's very powerful. So Abraham says this: please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. What's amazing to me is Abraham acted like a servant. Like he didn't call his servants and be like, you need to bake that, and you need to do that, and you need to do that. It seems like he and Sarah were doing most of this. But look at what he does in verse 8. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Remember, a servant doesn't eat with their masters. And here, this is Abraham, a really, really important man who lived, in this area. Everyone knew he was important. And yet, here he was treating these guests as if they were royalty. He wouldn't even eat with them. It was like he was their servant. But then after this visit, they kind of get to the point. The reason for this visit, kind of twofold. One was that they were going, that these 3, God and 2 of the angels, they wanted Abraham to know that they were there to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. That will be a big lesson next week, but that was the main reason for coming. But the other reason was to make sure that Abraham and Sarah knew that what God had been promising them for 25 years, this child of promise, was about to happen. In verse 9, he says, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? So he said, here in the tent. He said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? Now it's interesting that she laughs, because there's different kinds of laughs. There's a laugh, like a shocked laugh, like, ha, what? Okay, there's a confused laugh, which is what most of you do when I tell a joke, okay? It's that laughter of confusion, like, what does that even mean? And then there's a doubting laugh. And it's like, that's funny. No way, never gonna happen. We see Abraham's laugh here back in Genesis 17:17 in our last lesson. Said, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed when he found out he would have another child, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? But his laugh wasn't a laugh of disbelief. His laugh was a laugh of belief. I know it's true, it's funny, it's a funny story, but I do actually believe that God will come through. Sarah's laugh, on the other hand, was kind of a smirky, yeah, right, kind of a laugh. Verse 13 says this, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I'm old? Now, what's interesting is that if you look back at that verse, when she laughed, it says she laughed within herself. It's not like she laughed out loud, but this might have been the first time that Abraham, if he didn't know this was God, that suddenly he realized it was God. Because he didn't hear Sarah laugh, but the angels did, and God, one of the three men, God did. Verse 12 says this, therefore Sarah laughed within herself. And then verse 14 says this, is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah was embarrassed. She's like, I didn't laugh, because she was terrified. She was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. Sarah got caught, and she's probably like so embarrassed. But verse 14 is this great reminder to all of us, especially for those of you that think like, I really need God to come through here. And I just have to believe that he can. He's big enough to do this. Nothing is too hard for God. Jeremiah 32:17, ah, Lord, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. Never forget that. Jeremiah 32:27 says this, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me? And of course, we know the answer is absolutely not. There is nothing too hard for God. He created us. He created this world. And if he did that, he can do anything. But here's just what I want to say. Because I want you to know this right off the bat, that yes, sometimes God does step in and do miraculous things. We know he can, but he doesn't always. We know he can, but he doesn't always. And sometimes we have to remember that God created this world, this earth, to run a specific way. Sometimes he does step in, show up, do things miraculously, heal someone, save someone you never thought God would save, maybe take away an addiction or restore a relationship, things that you and I know would be completely miraculous. It's like when God turned the Nile to blood or parted the Red Sea. Those are miraculous things that would never just happen on its own. Or like we see today, a 90-year-old woman, barren for all of her life, suddenly now will be able to have a child. That's miraculous. And that's where we are with Sarah and Abraham. It's time for God to move past the natural and do something miraculous. Because in the natural, 90-year-old women can't physically have children. And that was the point. That was the point. And God gets all the credit because it's miraculous. But for something to be miraculous, here's what we know. God usually waits until the last minute. So that's what I want to talk about for the time that we have left. Because it's really, really important regarding our faith walk. It's really important because here's the deal. So often God waits and God does something when there's no hope left. There was no hope left for Abraham and Sarah to ever have a baby. There was no hope left in so many situations in my life, but then God showed up. And I think it's because so often he wants us to know that it's only because of him. None of this would have ever happened if it weren't for him stepping in. I assume most of you have your own last minute where God showed up story. If you've been to Bible study for any length of time, you know ours. We were selling a company, we had a business deal. It took about 2 years for this company to sell. We had outrageous attorney bills to the point that there's no way in this lifetime we could have paid these attorney bills if this deal didn't go through. The problem was that we were dealing with different countries for this deal, so there's lots of things, moving pieces that had to go with this. Rob would be up in the middle of the night having conference calls with people in other countries. And finally, it was supposed to close at 6 a.m. on a specific day. Everyone would call in from all over different parts of the world, and these signatures would happen then. But we had one partner who refused to sign. It was so random. It was so crazy. He hadn't signed the papers yet, so we said, hey, look, we're going to be there the night before, this 6 a.m., and we'll be at this hotel, just drop the papers off. He's like, yeah, no problem. He refused to sign the papers. And we didn't know what to do. We were driving back home that morning and we had no idea. We are an hour away from this signing and we don't even have the paperwork done. The guy refuses to sign. We didn't know what to do. And we drove that morning, and Mercy Me's song came on, Even If. The words say this: it's easy to sing when there's nothing to bring me down. It would have been really easy to sing if all the papers were signed and everything went great. But the next verse says this: but what will I say when I'm held to the flame like I am right now? And that's what we were held to the flame. We had no idea what we were going to do. We didn't know what God was doing. The next verse says this: I know you're able and I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand. It was like as driving down the hill, we said, God, I know you can do this. I don't know how. You have to change his heart. We have an hour. But I know you can. But we had to land on this. But even if you don't, my hope is in you alone. Even if you don't come through, then I know you're doing something different and you're going to make it all work out. I just trust you. And there we were. This partner was not a nice guy in any sense of the word. So it never occurred to us that he would actually sign the papers. So we got to our attorney's office and we sat there, and at 5:55 our attorney walked in. And he said, you're not going to believe this, but we just got a signature faxed over to us just a few minutes ago. Now, what was that all about? Why would he wait until the last minute? And see, some of you have that same story. You needed to pay your rent, and suddenly you go to the post office and a check came in the mail out of the blue. Last minute. Last minute, you've been praying and praying and praying for God to save your marriage, and your husband stops the divorce and wants to make it work out. Last minute. Last minute you found housing the day before your lease was up. Why in the world does God do that? Why does he wait till Sarah is 90 and Abraham is 99? And I think it's because of this. God wants to teach us to trust him, rely on him alone for what we know is impossible. See, if you knew this partner, this would all make sense to you. But God wanted to teach us a valuable lesson that he was the only one that could do something that the attorneys couldn't do. It was only God. And it was a life-changing moment. And honestly, it grows our faith. I think that's why God waits till the last minute. It grows our faith up. Because from that one event in our life, I think that grew our faith more than anything in the world. Because we prayed more, we sought God more, we clung to him more, we trusted him more. If this partner had signed a week earlier, we would never have been given the opportunity to trust and see that he was faithful to come through. Sometimes God waits to the last minute because he just wants us to turn to him and trust him. He wants to show us that he's that intimately involved in our lives. I think another reason he waits is because of this. It gives us stories to tell others about God. Stories that we know happen only because of God. There's no human explanation on how this happened. I'll tell you what happened this summer, and I'm telling you this because God gets all the glory for this. Our son Micah and his wife Shayla, they're moving to Texas. I think I've told most of you that. June rolls around. They have to be in Texas by July. They still do not have a house rented. They want to live in one specific area. It's called Lantana. Very, very few houses ever come up for rent. It's right by the kids' school. It's exactly where they want to be. It's right by the church where they want to be. And I kept saying, I don't know. I just know God always waits till the last minute because I learned that. So I know that, okay? So suddenly one miraculously comes on the market. And it's exactly where they want to be. And so they apply for it. They apply for a year rent. They send a letter. They send a picture of their family. They explain to them why they're moving. But someone else applies, and he applies with a 2-year lease. And so they find out that it went to this house that they wanted, went to this person with a 2-year lease, and they were pretty much devastated. So they found another house, not in the area that they want to be, and they were desperate now. They were like, okay, we have to move our family in like 2 weeks. We have nowhere to go. Like they just didn't know what to do. So they got scared, and I get that. And so they signed on this other house in a different area that they didn't love, but they knew they had to move. This was like on a Thursday. Mike and Sheila had a big family trip to Florida that they were leaving on Saturday. They find out on Friday that their flight from Phoenix to Florida, going right directly through, stopping in South Carolina, so it was like a layover in South Carolina and then on to Florida, was canceled. Now they're completely devastated. Their whole family's there. Everyone's there except them. Their flight has been reinstated for the following, on Sunday, at late in the afternoon. So they're just, Shayla's crying. She's like, why would this happen? It doesn't make any sense. But here's the miraculous part. Their connecting flight was no longer in South Carolina. Their connecting flight was in Dallas, Texas, with a 3-hour layover. So they hopped off the plane in Dallas. They got an Uber. They took their kids to the house that they were going to rent that they had signed on, and it was horrible. They didn't like the area. They didn't want the house. They were just so sad. They didn't know what to do. So they called the realtor and they said, oh, you're not going to believe this, but the owners of the house have never even signed. So you're good to go. We'll just put a cancellation in, no problem. They go to the house they want in Lantana. And they're like, this is the house we want. God, what do we do? So they called Rob, and Rob said, why don't you offer them a signing bonus? Why don't you take the 2-year deal and offer them, a few $1,000s or whatever as a signing bonus? Now, they think the house is already gone, but they did it anyway. And the guy took the deal. The guy took the deal. It was so cool. It's so cool how God literally shut down their flights, rerouted their flights, because he wanted to make sure that they got the right house. They would never have known that had they not actually been there to see this. And God knew it would take something like a signing bonus for this guy, apparently. But they never would have done that had they just been stuck in Phoenix. The point is this. Well, I'll finish that story really quick. They were leaving. They actually left today while I'm videotaping this. They left today, but as of yesterday, even though the guy agreed to the lease and agreed it, he never signed it. And so they're sitting there. They called yesterday morning to talk to Rob and said, we don't know what to do. The guy hasn't signed the lease. He promises to sign it, but he just hasn't signed it. We're leaving tomorrow. And all I could think about was Abraham. And so I said, Micah, if you really honestly feel like God is calling you to Texas, then go. And God called Abraham from Ur to go to, he didn't know where he was going, but God led him as he went. I said, maybe you'll get there and maybe you'll find a different house. Maybe God has a different plan. I don't know. Maybe this will be a moment of stepping out in faith. They texted us last night and said, the man finally signed the lease. So this morning, they sent us a little video. They're packed up. Shiloh, our 4-year-old granddaughter's Barbie house, is on top of the car. So there you go. All is well in the world. But that's my point. Why would God wait until the last minute? But I think it grew their faith and it gave them a story to say, let me tell you how God came through for us. We see it all through the Bible. When Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, God led them, to the Red Sea. Why would he do that? There's the sea in front of them. There's mountains all around them. They're trapped. Why would God do that? Pharaoh's army is almost upon them. At the last minute, God parts the sea. The last minute. Why not the day before? Because they really needed to see how powerful God was. They had to recognize that only a miracle from God could have saved them that day. Exodus 14:13, and Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, they shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and hold your peace. In other words, relax, trust him, understand he can do miraculous things, and he can save us. God wants to remind us who he is and what he really can do. And that is what the story of Abraham and Sarah does for us. It's this reminder that when God is ready, and if this particular thing, like the house in Lantana, is God's will, or you name your own issue in your life, that God can. He can move heaven and earth and step into the natural world and do something miraculous if he needs to. But what I learned from Sarah is this. Often God waits to the last minute when everything feels hopeless. But what I learned from her story today, and hopefully you will learn this too, is that God's timing is always perfect. He's never late. He knows what he's doing. He wants us to trust him. But sometimes the only way to build that trust is to withhold what we need until the last minute. And then he steps in and he does what we know that he is the only one that can. And then he gets all the glory. And we have just learned that we have placed our faith and trust in a God that can do anything and that is so personal and is there for us all the time. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this incredible passage today. Thank you that you do the most miraculous things and you show up late, but in the midst of that, we learn so much about you. God, I pray for those that are waiting on something today. I pray for those that are waiting to hear your voice on something today. I pray that you would just make it very clear, but help us to understand that you know what's best for us. And you have you want us to learn to trust you. And I pray that we will do that. I pray that this message today will help someone, whatever they're going through, to sit back, relax, trust, and wait, knowing that you are their shepherd. And we thank you so much for that. In your son, Jesus' name, amen. Have a really good week.